Bomb's going in a minute. Bomb.
Hey, Jimmy, trains are behind us.
Bomb gentlemen.
Where is he, rear gunner? Can you see him? Down! Down!
Down.
Did you shoot him down?
Yeah.
He's got him, boy, right in the middle. Bloody good.
Bloody good. Photograph taken. Keep waving. There's some slack coming at me.
Okay, don't shout all at once.
Alright. Photograph taken.
Okay, photograph taken. Hello, skipper. Will you turn on to 081?
In April 1944, a fully laden Halifax bomber was approaching the target at Tournai in France when it shot down less than 4 minutes from its target by a German night fighter. Tommy Crossman, a Halifax pilot, only on his second mission of the war, and the youngest of 3 brothers in the Air Force, was wounded and knocked unconscious. He manages to bail out and parachute to safety seconds before the right wing of the aircraft breaks off and crashes to the ground. 7,000 miles away, Tommy's older brother Ted, an aircraft fitter with a Blenheim squadron, is going into his second year in captivity against the Japanese in Java. Unlucky enough to be left behind, he was captured as the British retreated south. Ted would spend the next 3.5 years in captivity. Fred, the middle brother, a pugnacious Lancaster bomber air gunner, is in England under close arrest. He's marched before the group commander and accused of avoiding bombing operations, a charge so repellent with such lifelong stigma that most air crews chose to face the flak and the night fighters rather than to avoid it. These 3 brothers, like thousands in bomber command during the war, were part of that greatest generation to whom we owe so much. Yet these 3 brothers were fairly unremarkable. They didn't win any medals. They didn't contribute to the war effort really, but they all volunteered in perhaps the greatest land conflict in modern history. And with only RAF records to go by, we can trace their unique wartime experiences of these 3 brothers. So this then is their story. While the north of England was suffering through the depression of the 1930s, Bournemouth on the south coast was relatively affluent. The Crossman family lived in a fairly modern 3-bedroom detached brick house in the suburbs. The boy's father, Benjamin, a World War I Navy minesweeper veteran, worked as a carpenter building houses. Ted, the eldest, was slim, medium height, with his father's narrow face and slightly hawkish nose. He was a motor mechanic by trade, and in 1939 was nearly 20. Fred, by comparison, was quite different. Stockier, with a more rounded face and a mischievous but cocky grin and a flatter nose. In many respects, he resembled a boxer and had the temperament of one too. He had an obvious dislike for rules, which showed in a 1950 speeding fine reported in the local papers. Crossman was said to have told the motor patrol officer who stopped him, "I am in a hurry to get to Cheltenham for a cup of tea." Tommy, the youngest brother of the 3, had a round, jolly face, bright dark eyes with a wide and easy grin like a Cheshire cat. He was also the shortest of the 3, at barely 5'4" tall. When war began, Tommy was still 3 months shy of his 17th birthday. After the narrow victory of the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940, the RAF found itself woefully inadequate and unmatched against the German Luftwaffe. Its bomber force was obsolete, it couldn't hit targets properly, and it was still developing its strategy. In the Far East, however, there was no match of old 1930s-style aircraft against the tide of the Japanese sweeping down the Malay Peninsula, over the once impregnable fortress of Singapore, and into the Dutch-held islands of Java and Sumatra. In May 1940, Germany invaded France and the Low Countries in a blitzkrieg attack. Within weeks, France falls and the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk leaves Europe in the hands of Germany. Now aged 20, Ted decided to join up. He signed on in Uxbridge, was issued his uniform, and underwent a week of unbearable RAF bureaucracy and administration. Being a motor mechanic, he was sent off to RAF St. Athan to train as an engine fitter. By December of 1940, he had qualified and was sent to various operational training units to work with real operational ground crews and real operational aircraft. His records show that he was stationed at RAF Harwell in Berkshire, servicing the twin-engine Wellington bombers that were operating over Belgium before the fall of France. Ted remained in Berkshire until May 1941, where, after a year in the RAF and only seeing the war reflected in the damage to returning aircraft, was about to be posted directly into harm's way. Ted was ordered to report to Liverpool to board a troop ship which made its way to the Clyde and formed up as part of convoy WS-8B. Not knowing where he was headed, Ted looked out across the Clyde and the other 7 ships steaming out into the Atlantic. A seaman on watch on the cruiser HMS Exeter recalls a German air attack. We watched it come boldly straight on at about 200 feet. You could even see the pilots in my binoculars. As it went through the outer screen of the destroyers, 2 of them started firing. They'd seen the crosses on it. A red glow came inside her as she headed for the bright painted ammunition ship just a mile away. Tried to drop a load on it, but luckily for us and the nearby ships, she missed. Unknown by Ted, the convoy was also steaming directly into the path of the most feared German battleship, the Bismarck. By the 24th or 25th of May, the convoy was off the coast of France, deep in the Atlantic. The Bismarck was steaming south, directly at the troop ships, and being pursued frantically by the Royal Navy's fastest and most formidable warships. Bismarck was later sunk on the 27th of May, a day or so after Ted's convoy passed by. By the beginning of June, the ships had docked in Freetown, Sierra Leone, to refuel. They then moved on to Durban in South Africa, arriving near the end of June. The military rumour machine was in full swing about their destination, and with 2 weeks of shore leave in Durban for Ted, it only increased the uncertainty. By the 4th of July 1941, Ted set sail once more heading east on the SS Sibiag, a Dutch liner requisitioned by the British as a troop ship and loaded with 800 servicemen. Sibiak sailed on its own to Bombay and Ceylon under the guard of a succession of Royal Navy cruisers who escorted the ship for a leg of the journey before handing over to another vessel. After 58 days at sea, Ted finally reaches Singapore in mid-July 1941. He spends a bit of time at a transit camp and is assigned to 62 Squadron RAF, flying Bristol Blenheims, twin-engine fighter bombers. He endures the usual RAF bureaucracy and administration machine, gets issued his butt hat and his tropical uniform, and gets the arm-deadening vaccinations that he needs for living in the jungle. He then boards a train for the 400-mile journey up the Malay Peninsula to Alistar to join his unit. The squadron's strength in 1941 was 11 Bristol Blenheim aircraft. The tropical conditions, however, were hard on the engines that Ted was responsible for fitting, maintaining and repairing It was a bit of a holiday camp, really. There were natives, there were palm trees, and Alistar even had its own cinema called the Empire, which played Western movies. Life was a fairly routine existence and a far cry from the death and destruction in Europe at that time. But all this was about to change pretty rapidly. On December 7th, 1941, an hour and 10 minutes before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese invaded British-held Malaya and Siam in a surprise invasion on the east coast, only 70 miles from Ted's airfield. Racing to react, Ted and his colleagues prepared the squadron aircraft, which took off on the only operational combat sortie that 62 Squadron ever conducted. Soon after the aircraft returned from the mission, Japanese aircraft found and attacked the airfield at Alistar. Bombs rained down on the parked aircraft, killing several of the ground personnel and destroying aircraft. The next day, Ted and the squadron were evacuated to RAF Butterworth in northwest Malaya, where they were again attacked by Japanese aircraft, just when the British force was preparing to take off. Ted's unit retreated further south down the Malay Peninsula from airfield to airfield, repairing a dwindling supply of aircraft. By December the 18th, there were only 2 remaining serviceable aircraft. Ted was pressed into airfield defense with the other ground crews, and after a few more days, they made their way further south down to Singapore in open-top lorries with no food and having lost all their kit. They were back where they started 6 months ago. At Singapore, the RAF men were issued some new clothing and equipment and received a few new replacement aircraft. By Christmas Day 1941, there were no remaining aircraft, and the Japanese were bombing and machine gunning the airfields on a daily basis. A one-sided war of attrition began, with the RAF being destroyed daily and fewer replacements arriving from England. In one day alone, 12 replacement Hudson aircraft arrived. By the evening, all 12 had been bombed and burnt out where they stood. By the end of January 1942, Ted and the rest of 62 Squadron were relocated by ship to the Dutch island of Sumatra and the town of Palembang, where Royal Dutch Shell had massive oil refineries. Just days later, the Japanese forces landed on the east coast of Sumatra, and the squadron was forced to conduct meager attacks in their remaining aircraft. After 3 weeks of trying to stem the Japanese landings, Ted looked up into the cloud-spotted sky to see new Hudson bombers approach their airfield at Palembang. As he watched, small white puffs appeared from the aircraft. These were not anti-aircraft bursts, but Japanese parachuters descending on the airfield. With no airfield defences, Ted and the other ground staff buried or destroyed any key equipment and raced for the trucks in the clothes they stood up in. As Ted escaped the filing at Palembang, the oil refinery was set ablaze and burned for days, blanketing the area in black smoke. The trucks drove through the night until they reached the coast, where in dribs and drabs they were evacuated to the Javanese capital, Batavia, now modern-day Jakarta. When they landed, they heard the awful news that Singapore, the eastern jewel in the British Empire, had fallen to the Japanese. Still with no kit and equipment, Ted volunteered to join an Australian Air Force squadron, and they moved west to a new airfield, the last one remaining at Kalajati. For several weeks, the Japanese relentlessly bombed and strafed the airfield where the remaining aircraft were. The last few aircraft took off for the Australian mainland, and Ted was left on his own with the ground crew. In early March 1942, Japanese tanks rolled onto the airfield and began firing at the aircraft that were leaving. Ted escaped into the jungle, and behind him he could hear the sounds of fighting. Of the RAF and the Army defenders on the airfield, not one of them survived. Along with the rest of the people escaping, Ted made his way south 100 miles to the town of Garot, a small Dutch colony nestled in the volcanoes. A few weeks later, the commander declared Garot an open town, meaning there'd be no defense against the Japanese. And by the 20th of March, 1942, the Allied forces formally surrendered to the Japanese. Ted wouldn't see England again for another 3.5 years. From 1942 onward, the British bombing campaign against Germany became less restrictive and increasingly targeted industrial sites and the civilian manpower base essential for German war production. The bomber campaign provided a valuable and the only front line against Germany before the Allies were strong enough to invade France in 1944. Over 360,000 operational sorties were flown. More than 1 million tons of bombs were dropped and over 8,000 aircraft were lost in action. Bomber command crews also suffered a high casualty rate. 55,000 were killed out of a total of 125,000 aircrew. Nearly 10,000 became prisoners of war. With the war nearly 2 years old, and the Battle of Britain won, and conscription looming, Tommy, who was now 18, decided to join the Air Force. He applied at Oxford and was sent for an Aircrew Selection Board assessment to determine his fitness, whether he could be a pilot. Having attended the selection board, he was promptly put on the reserve list and told to wait. Despite all the war preparations, there were too many recruits for the Air Force to process. They hadn't enough aircraft or bases or instructors to train them all. Tommy had to wait an agonizing 6 months before he was called back up. As Ted was marched into an uncertain fate as a POW, Tommy finally received a letter telling him to report not to an airfield, but the Lord's Cricket Ground in London. Testing was then carried out to identify potential aircrew types. One RAF veteran recalled the experience. Service life started here. I was surprised when we were located in London when one bomb could have wiped out hundreds of potential aircrew. We were immediately issued with our kit and our uniform, then had to march to our billets carrying our civilian suitcases, 2 kit bags, backpack, side pack and gas mask case. We soon realized how unfit we were. For the next 6 weeks, Tommy was given a travel order and a rail voucher and told to report not to an RAF base, but the Prince of Wales Hotel in sunny Scarborough to an initial training wing. After being beaten into RAF shape, Tommy was given yet another rail voucher and reported not to a hotel again, but to RAF Sywell to see if he had the ability to be taught how to fly. For nearly 2 months, Tommy underwent basic flying training in the oldest aircraft that the RAF had to offer, the Tiger Moth. Because of the ongoing war in the UK, many RAF recruits selected for pilot training were sent to the US or Canada to learn to fly. The British Commonwealth Air Training Plan was set up to train the thousands of pilots needed for the war effort. After a period of leave following Tommy's training, he boarded a ship across the Atlantic and then another train for a 5-day journey across Canada to the Saskatchewan prairies. Over the next 6 months, Tommy was selected to be a bomber pilot and sent to learn how to fly multi-engined aircraft. Life in Canada was pretty enjoyable for Tommy. The local residents of the town welcomed the young, well-paid trainee pilots into their homes and establishments, and Tommy was initially billeted with a local family. Compared to wartime England, Canada was essentially a peacetime country, with food and fun aplenty. The base held dances, movies and theatre shows virtually every week. Wartime Canada was very different from the hard British experience in the winter of 1942 and 43. Eventually, and without any serious aircraft crashes, of which there were many and often fatal, Tommy was promoted to sergeant, and in April 1943 got his wings. While Tommy was learning how not to crash his Tiger Moth, Ted had spent the past 6 months in a disused prison at Glodok in Jakarta. Crammed with over 2,500 British and Australian POWs, they were given meagre rations and had to barter with the locals. They were then put to work at the airfield filling shell craters. Terence Kelly, a fighter pilot and POW at Glodok, said, "Some even slept, but not for long, for as darkness fell, the bugs attacked. There seemed to be at least one of them for every square inch of floor, and they moved at quite astonishing speeds. Nothing can compare to the awfulness of that first night at Glodok. The wetness of bug blood, the stink of unwashed bodies, the explosions of excretion and curses, the snoring and the teeth grinding, the farting, the sense of disbelief, of helplessness, of anger, the sheer impossibility of such a situation all came together to make that night a hell." By September of 1942, Ted was admitted to a POW hospital at a converted convent called Mater Dolorosa, suffering from cerebral meningitis. He would spend the next 4 months trying to recover, on pitiful rations and with POW doctors who had to beg and barter for medical supplies. As the war went on, Japanese tolerance for the POWs gradually decreased, and their propensity for callousness increased. While Fred was beginning his RAF service, and Tommy was steaming back to England as a newly minted RAF pilot, Ted was beginning his 2nd year of captivity. He was moved to a new camp, Makassar, in Jakarta. It was a transit camp, a POW holding area with one purpose, and that was to get POWs ready to ship to labour camps in Singapore, Burma and Japan. Many of these POWs would never get there, as Allied submarines torpedoed the merchant ships, the Japanese guards leaving them to die in the locked holds. Ted was lucky. The next camp he would get to, at Pekanbaru, was even worse. He would be building a pointless railway through the jungle in Sumatra, a railway that would see many of the POWs die. Left at home in Bournemouth, Fred was in a protected trade as a tool grinder or a machinist, and apparently had no desire to change things. Now over 21 years old, he was eligible for conscription, and rather than forcibly joining the army to dig trenches, like his brothers, he signed up in the RAF. Following the same route as Tommy, he was eventually selected for aircrew and ushered off for aircrew training as an air gunner, but with little idea that he was joining Bomber Command at its worst time of the war and facing significant losses. Fred began his training as an air gunner at RAF Stormy Down in South Wales, a windswept and wet airfield where records show that flying was frequently stopped or started late in the day and then finished early, all due to poor weather. For Fred, the course involved fairly intensive groundwork and in-flight work. In the classroom, they were focused on the operation and the maintenance of Browning machine guns, as well as how to use the turrets in the air. Each student had between 15 and 20 hours air-to-air work firing at targets towed by aircraft. Over the course, Fred would fire over 3,000 rounds of ammunition on the ground and from his turret. Target flags were used and trailed 3,000 or 4,000 feet behind the towing aircraft. After the gunnery exercise, the flags were dropped at Stormy Down Airfield, where an assessment of the strikes were made by the coloured rounds that had been fired. At Stormy Down, a student recorded his experience in this journal. A sickly mixture of glycol antifreeze, petrol and warm oil replaced the clean air I'd been breathing. the temperature in the plane would have wilted tomato plants. At the height of 5,000 feet, with the Anson rising and sinking at irregular intervals, the fuselage with cordite fumes which, mixed with the other smells, produced a nauseating stench, doing nothing to help my stomach, my sweating or my headache. My head was stuck up in the plexiglass dome like a light bulb in an upturned goldfish bowl. Sweat dripped from my nose. I had no room to move my feet, let alone my body. I squeezed the triggers of the guns to get the whole performance over with as quickly as possible. Cordite fumes invaded my nostrils until I could hardly breathe. It was a bedraggled and disillusioned airman who eventually fell half out of the turret to be violently sick. After 6 weeks of alternating vomiting and machine gunning, Fred completed his training, was promoted sergeant, and awarded his air gunner wings to be pinned on his battle dress uniform. In the summer and autumn of 1943, Fred and Tommy both began the last phase of their training, the operational training units. The OTU were used to take cadets with elementary bomber training and put them together into crews. Fred went on to fly twin-engine Wellington bombers, while Tommy headed to Abingdon in Oxfordshire to fly as a pilot in antiquated Whitley bombers. The trainees carried out various flying exercises, each designed to train the various crew positions, as well as timed routes culminating in bombing, known as bullseye. Nickel was the code name given to leaflet raids over France, conducted as the final exercise at an OTU, in order to introduce crews to flying in enemy territory. The aircraft did not carry bombs, but instead were designed to drop leaflets over the target, and the prevailing wind would then cause them to fall in the streets of whichever city the aircraft were detailed to. Fred's first operational sortie was at the beginning of October to Orléans in France. Now and then crews decided not to untie the bundles to make more of an impact on the ground, although somewhat defeating the point of a leaflet drop, and occasionally accompanying the task with a few empty beer bottles, which whistled on the way down like bombs. After the war, Bomber Command Chief Sir Arthur Harris commented that nickel raids served to supply the continent's requirements of toilet paper for the 5 long years of war. One of the key components of OTU was the process of crewing up. Fred did not get pulled into a crew, however, either because he didn't fit, or most likely because there were no mid-upper gunners and turrets on Wellington or Whitley aircraft. Tommy pulled a crew together at Abingdon, but there's only one small entry in the record book for his future bomber squadron showing all their names. Except for Tommy and one other, all of them would be dead within 6 months. Moving from smaller twin-engine aircraft to the comparatively massive Lancaster and Halifax bombers, Fred and Tommy had to spend a couple of weeks at a heavy conversion unit. First operational in 1943, these heavy bombers could carry a bigger bomb load deeper into Germany as part of the Bomber Command air plan. Each with a crew of 7, these large machines were more complex and daunting for a newly qualified aircrew. Fred, however, had still not been placed into a crew, and from the various RAF records, seemed to have been moved about as he went from course to course. His final training was at a Lancaster finishing school, where the crews were trained on the latest Lancaster bomber. Only 5 days into his course at the Lancaster finishing school, and on the New Year's Eve of 1943-1944, Fred and his buddies went out to celebrate. He promptly got into a fight with a Canadian airman. An airman who was a lot better boxer than Fred was. He was admitted to Nottingham General Hospital and later transferred to RAF Rousby with a severe head injury. Based on the duration that Fred was in hospital, he had fairly persistent headaches which prevented his return to training. But after 2 weeks, he was discharged and sent back to his training class. This time, he was paired up with young pilot officer Harry Forrest in a Lancaster. On completion of the course, him and the crew were sent to RAF Bardney, 9 Squadron, one of the Dambuster units. While Fred was moving down the road to 9 Squadron, Tommy was destined for 10 Squadron at RAF Melbourne in Yorkshire. After a few days on the squadron, he was sent to attack Leipzig. And unknown to Fred, his brother Tommy was on the Halifax aircraft sent out on the disastrous raid. On the 19th of February, Tommy saw his name on the operations board with an Australian crew on a mission to Leipzig. Bomber Command crews had to do at least 30 sorties as part of an operational tour, whereas Tommy, as a new pilot, had to do 2 missions as a second pilot or a second dickie. He had to do this with a veteran crew to get the experience he needed before he took over his own aircraft and his own valuable crew. Tommy took off at 11:45 on Halifax P for Papa, heading for Leipzig, a target deep in German territory and near the limit of the Halifax fuel range. The aircraft departed from Melbourne Airfield, turned east and headed towards enemy territory, crossing the Dutch coast and moving towards Hanover before turning south for the run-in to the target. At 4:22 in the morning, Tommy's aircraft reached the target area and, being rather early, had to orbit the city at 22,000 feet, waiting for the pathfinders to fly in and drop the target indicators. For Tommy, the Leipzig raid was a real baptism of fire. 466 Squadron Flight Engineer Ken Handley's diary recorded the following recollections. No clouds obscured the target, and it was shown up by cones of searchlights and fighter flares. The ground markers giving off their orange colours were spread all over the target area. The town was blazing up like hell let loose, and fires could be definitely seen. Evasive action was taken running up to the target to keep clear of the searchlights, one of which picked us up after the bombing. Diving down, we eluded it and almost cleaned up a Lancaster below us. Flak was coming up, but very little reached us. One aircraft was combed by searchlights over Frankfurt, and everything was thrown up at him, including the kitchen sink. One 9 Squadron Lancaster failed to return from this raid, along with 78 other bombers. Some 420 aircrew were killed, and a further 131 became prisoners of war. It was at that time by far the RAF's most costly raid of World War II. After just 10 days on the squadron, Fred has seen 3 major raids go out as part of Bomber Command's offensive against German cities. He's witnessed 3 complete Lancaster crews be lost out of a squadron of only 24. Both he and Tommy have joined their operational units at the height of the Bomber Command losses. Fred was now faced with the possibility of real action, and like many air crews, he decided to badger all the veteran crews to see what they would tell him. Many wouldn't talk. They didn't want to share with the new guys. Pilot Officer Forrest, on the other hand, was on his first operational sortie to gain combat experience. And what experience it was. His first trip was to Berlin. When he got back, Forrest, Fred, and the rest of the crew flew some cross-country sorties to gain some experience around the airfield, and also to beat up and train the rest of the crew for their missions ahead. In February 1944, Bomber Command Chief Sir Arthur Harris was forced to take his attention off of bombing cities and focus on tactical targets with the US Air Force. On the 24th of February, the 8th Air Force carried out a large daylight raid on the ball bearing industrial plant at Schweinfurt in Germany. The RAF planned to attack the same targets on the night of the 24th, led by 734 aircraft, split into 2 waves, each 2 hours apart. This new tactic of splitting the main force proved successful, at least to the crews in the second wave. 50% less aircraft were lost in that second wave due to the night fighters already having landed after attacking the first wave. In total, 33 aircraft were to be lost during the raid. Fred's aircraft was to be sent in on the first wave. Before any of the crew preparations began on the morning of the 24th of February, Fred is hauled before the B-Fight commander and given a severe reprimand, which is recorded in his file. There are no other surviving files or diaries or letters to explain why Fred received a severe reprimand, although later disciplinary actions begin to show a possible trend. Hours later, still fuming from his disciplinary action, Fred took off from Bardney at 6:54 p.m. stuck in his mid-upper turret, he was most likely and quite understandably scared stiff about the coming first mission. So on a cold and snowy evening, Fred's crew and Lancaster R. Robert, with the nose art for the Spirit of Russia, took off and headed into the darkening eastern sky towards Germany. The bomber stream crossed the French coast near Calais and continued southeast along the German border, but still over French territory. The aircraft turned near Stuttgart and headed north for the final run-in to the target at Schweinfurt. Just after 11 p.m. and at 22,000 feet, R. Robert attacked the target, dropping its bombs. By 20 after 11, the aircraft had turned for home as large fires on the ground were seen to merge into one big mass. Fred, in the mid-upper turret, had a grandstand view of the action. 7:30 a.m. the next morning, and running dangerously low on petrol, R. Robert touched down at Barford St. John, an alternative airfield. As he stepped out of his turret and exited the aircraft, Fred was thankful to be home in one piece. Fred's crew flew back to Barford St. John the day after the raid, and missed the following mission to bomb Augsburg. However, by the following Monday, Fred is once again hauled in front of the squadron commander for an unauthorized absence over the weekend. Fred's crew didn't conduct any operations, although they were planned but later cancelled. However, Fred was not around to find out about it anyway. On the 4th of March, 1944, Fred is given the leave that he was apparently promised, and at 22 years old, Air Gunner Sergeant Fred Crossman marries the 23-year-old Molly Wotton. 9th of March. Again, Fred's discipline records show an unauthorized absence from the squadron for one day, on a Thursday, after his wedding. Specific timings listed on the record indicate that Fred showed up again at 4 p.m. that day. The squadron was also warned off for operations and flew against targets in France. The next day, Fred was once more charged with an unauthorized absence from the RAF, from Friday until Saturday, even though he had shown up on the afternoon before. And this time no operations were planned. Another entry appeared in Fred's records for an unauthorized absence over the next weekend of 17th to 19th of March. That weekend, however, all crews were warned off for operations to attack Frankfurt. Fred's crew then flew on without him. Normal Bomber Command leave policy was 1 week for every 6 of operations. Fred had only done 1 operation. It was normal for 48-hour leave passes to be granted, so maybe this was a case of multiple leave passes going wrong, or maybe it was just a case of Fred deciding to make up his own RAF rules. We just don't know. In March 1944, as the tempo of operations against Germany increased, Fred's crew is warned off for a mission to Frankfurt. But that same morning, Fred is hauled before the squadron commander and placed under close arrest. In the guardroom south, to prevent him going absent anymore, Fred listened to the aircraft taking off without him. We don't know whether he was relieved or whether he was frustrated. But in the meantime, he was stuck here while the squadron leader decided what to do with him next. In the run-up to D-Day, Allied bombers targeted roads, bridges, and rail networks to disrupt the Germans' ability to bring supplies and troops to the potential beachheads. Having newly arrived at 10 Squadron, Tommy still needed to fly a second pilot sortie with an experienced crew. He's put on board Flight Lieutenant Barnes, a second tour bomber pilot with a DFC. Tommy's brand new Halifax aircraft, J. Johnny, took off at 9:05 on the night of 10th of April from RAF Melbourne. The target was to be the large rail yards at Ternier, north of Paris. The raid was to be a success, with the target seriously damaged, but this came at a cost of losing some 10 aircraft, with the 57 aircrew being killed. Only one of 10 squadron aircraft failed to return, and this was Tommy's aircraft. As the Halifax crossed the French coast over Le Havre, it headed towards the target, with unseen bombers all around, and Tommy, standing just behind the pilot, watched to see how he used the throttle and checked in with the other crew and managed the large aircraft. He was stood right next to the right side of the fuselage when around midnight, and only 4 minutes to the target, a German night fighter struck. A twin-engine German night fighter, fitted with upward-firing cannon, glided silently underneath the big bomber and fired directly into the right wing. Immediately, the two engines and fuel tank caught fire. Tommy was wounded in the arm and the hand, thrown against the bulkhead and momentarily knocked out. As the big bomber plunged towards the ground, the remainder of the crew started to bail out through the forward hatch, while the rear gunner fired desperately at the night fighter. No sooner than Tommy managed to dive out of the escape hatch, the right wing of the Halifax broke free and the laden bomber plummeted to the ground, its full bomb load exploding on impact. Back at Melbourne, all the other aircraft had returned. The logbook shows that Tommy's aircraft was missing, no signals sent or received since takeoff. Tommy landed in a ploughed field about a mile from the crash site. He was just south of a small village, Burzy-le-Sec. He had injured himself when he bailed out. He could see a few more parachutes in the air, but he couldn't get to them. The crash and the flames from the aircraft had alerted the German soldiers nearby, and they were on their way. Tommy buried his parachute in his Mae West, and he was torn between heading north and escaping, or seeking help for his injured hand. He chose to seek help. He was subsequently captured in Soissons. 3 years of expensive RAF training was gone, and he was only 21 years old. He hadn't flown his aircraft as a pilot in combat, and he hadn't contributed anything to the war effort. But he was still alive. In Bournemouth, Benjamin Crossman, the boy's father, opened the door to receive a cream-coloured post office telegram informing him that their youngest son was missing in action. This was his second such telegram of the war. Back in England, Fred is officially out of bomber operations. Languishing in the cells for a few weeks, he is then driven up to RAF Waddington, the base HQ, marched in front of the base commander, given another severe reprimand, had a one-sided interview, was marched out again. The RAF chain of command truly believed that fear was contagious and enacted policies so severe that airmen wouldn't go anywhere near it. The LMF, or lack of moral fighter, policy. Fred was moved to an aircrew disposal unit at Chessington. It did its job well. It sorted out those who were genuine neurological cases and those who just didn't want to fly. The activities they did there were in part designed to restore the airmen's self-confidence, pride and sense of unit and duty. Activities involved seeing patriotic films, going to movies, going to theatres and other cultural places. On a darker side, while Fred was there, some of them were used as pallbearers on the funerals of airmen who had died on accidents and combat duty. Fred was designated as a waverer. Waverers were deemed to be fully fit for flying, but fearful. Fear was expected from bailing out, shaky-doos, and general combat fatigue, but Fred had none of these. He had just had one mission. And so he went through the system fairly quickly. After 7 weeks at Chessington, on a perfectly warm June afternoon, Fred went before an assessment board. The board was unable to declare him unfit to fly because of fear. He hadn't flown any operations. He was stripped of his wings and his stripes, labelled a waverer, discharged from the Air Force. It appears that Fred was caught up in the LMF and waverer discipline chain, and we don't know why. He did forfeit the confidence of his commanding officer, however, and was discharged to the Royal Navy. His services were no longer required. the RAF rank of private, Fred was packed off to a maintenance unit in Dumbarton, Scotland. It was responsible for repairing RAF rescue launches. In September 1944, a year and a half after Fred had joined the Air Force, he was discharged. Just 1 week before his discharge, and before he had to report for the Navy, Fred headed home to Bournemouth, where Molly was waiting to give birth to their first son, Trevor, whom he would rarely see for the next 2 years. In September 1944, after the ordeal in the RAF, Fred is sent for basic trade training for 4 months at HMS Royal Arthur and completed a basic course. He then moved on to training in stores and supply management, a far cry from the importance of a Bomber Command airman. Training completed, Fred boarded a convoy ship from England all the way to India, where after 5 weeks at sea, he reported to HMS Braganza in Bombay as a Navy storeman. Braganza was the base stores and parts distribution centre for the whole of the East Indies Command and held spares for all the ships in the area, everything from spare propellers to nuts and bolts or engines. Fred would spend the next year and a half in India as his young son Trevor grew up without him. While Tommy began life as a POW in Germany and Fred was gloomily waiting in Scotland, Ted was entering his final year of captivity under the Japanese and would barely survive the experience. Ted and the rest of the 1,000 inmates were transferred from Jakarta, packed into the dank hold of a ship for 3 weeks and shipped 800 miles up the coast of Sumatra to the town of Pekanbaru. Even in the 1930s, Dutch engineers had considered the idea of building a railway through the inhospitable jungles in Java. There were swamps to go through, rivers to cross, and all manner of other diseases. But the problem wasn't the logistics. The problem was how to do it with manpower. When the Japanese had tens of thousands of POWs, their manpower problem was solved. Imagine a series of barbed wire compounds in the dark, with ourselves a gathering furtive stream of all races, east and west, in every kind of clothing, or none. Here an old tunic in rags with a pair of cut-down pajamas, there a blanket, shivering case of malaria. At last a long procession of stooping figures creeps down the road, with jabbering nips cracking at their shins with a rifle or the flat of a sword, most of them half naked, others shambling along with their feet bound up in lousy rags over tropical sores. Some Jap would rush up and down, hurling anything any of them still possessed all over the place, while as sure as the clock, the dreadful, hopeless rain would begin again. Everything swilling into the filthy, racing storm gutters, men trying to reach out and rescue a bit of kit, others clutching hold of a wife's photo or such like souvenir of home, small hope. And at last, after 2 or 3 hours, when everyone was soaking and shivering with cold, the dreary hunted column would crawl down the road into an isolation compound, with no light, no food, and no knowledge of where to find a tap or a latrine, with wet bedding or none at all. Between May and August 1945, Ted worked on the railway along with thousands of other POWs. For over 220 kilometers, the track stretched into the jungle. By the 15th of August 1945, the railway was complete, and ironically, the same week the Japanese surrendered. For Ted's labor and the lives of 700 POWs, tens of thousands of natives, the line was never used. Tommy was sent to Dulag-Luft near Frankfurt as an initial processing centre. But as the pilot, he wasn't of much use. He was just the driver. He was pretty soon put on a train and sent way east to Lithuania, to Stalag Luft 6, Heidekrug. Heidekrug housed 9,000 prisoners. Some records kind of show that it was a bunch of airmen who were constantly trying to escape and digging tunnels everywhere. But the reality was, for some, the war had ended, and they just wanted to relax. All sorts of things were done there. Courses, plays, sports games. For a lot of them, it was just waiting and boredom. Some time after Tommy's capture, a letter arrived at the boy's father's house, joyfully explaining that Tommy was now a prisoner of war. As the Russian front shrank and the Allies gained a foothold in Normandy, the POWs were herded back to the station. They were loaded onto cattle carts, 60 at a time. They had to defecate and urinate where they stood. Only after they asked the guards to open the doors a fraction of an inch did the smell and the mess get any better. By mid-July 1944, Tommy had reached Stalag 357, the Thorn, in Poland. But within a few weeks, he would move again, this time to Fallingbostel, northern Germany. He joined the tens of thousands of POWs slogging their way west. And they were loaded onto trains, and as they got into Germany, they could see, high up in the air, Allied bombers, unopposed by the Luftwaffe. At Fallingbostel, things were different. On the pine-studded heathland with sandy soil, the Germans were at the end of their rope. Rations were scarce. The POWs were forced to scavenge for scraps. They were given maybe just a moldy potato, and that was it. The rain constantly sapped their bodies. It rained 41 days out of 50 there. They were constantly wet. Inside their barrack blocks, water dripped down the walls. Green mold grew on the side of the wood. They slept in wet blankets. The various illnesses and diseases meant that they had uncontrolled bladders. Shamelessly, some of the prisoners went to bed wet, and they woke up wet as well. It was a miserable existence for them. On Good Friday 1945, 6,000 Red Cross parcels arrived. The prisoners went down to the train yards to collect them in a truck. This was their only link to home and the comforts they knew. The camaraderie of Heidekrug and Stalag Luft 6 seemed a long, long way away. The Red Cross parcels were a lifeline. In the closing stages of the war, in April 1945, some 12,000 prisoners left Fallingbostel for the long march north. It was cold and crisp, and as they left the camp and marched down towards train stations, they could see tiny silver dots in the sky, Allied aircraft and bombers, unopposed. They headed north, keeping to side roads, sleeping in barns, scrounging rations wherever they could. Some Germans took pity on them and gave them rations. Others just scorned them. They were a pitiful sight. The weather was grim, typical for this time of year. Snow and rain. The men, tired and hungry, ill, they scavenged for what they could find en route, walking between 10 and 20 miles a day. After 10 days, they reached the River Elbe. On the 17th of April, 1945, Tommy and two others took a chance. They were just before the River Elbe, which was going to be the cutoff point. 7th Armoured Brigade was heading up behind them. The nearer village, they took their chance and escaped. Tommy was found by soldiers of the advancing 7th Armoured Division, who had just liberated Fallingbostel camp a few days previously. Released from captivity, Tommy and the other two POWs moved to the rear of the Allied units for medical attention and food and a debriefing by intelligence staff. He had been a prisoner of war for over one of the hardest years for POWs. As the Allies pushed east, captured German airfields became home to hundreds of RAF bombers, freed up from dropping explosives on target, and now used to fly the thousands of POWs back to England. Tommy boarded a bomber and arrived at RAF Cosford. They were taken up to a hangar set up as a welcome centre with flags and welcome signs. WAFs were on hand to give out tea, and they received advance pay, rest, and re-kitted with new uniforms. And between April and August 1945, Tommy attended various medical rehab centres, had home leave, and finally in November 1945 is discharged from the RAF as an ex-POW. In the Sumatran jungle in September 1945, just after the Japanese surrender, Ted was in the hospital camp at Pekanbaru when Lady Mountbatten visited him. 5 days later, he was on his way back to the same reception centre that Tommy was at. Only this time, he flew there in a Dakota all the way from Singapore. Several months later, he was back in hospital again, and then finally discharged from the RAF. His experiences, for now, were over. 6 months later, in March 1946, with England returning to post-war life, rationing, rebuilding, and new jobs, Fred returned from India. For the next 2 months, he battled the Navy bureaucracy, waiting to be demobilised. All three brothers were now back in Bournemouth. One of them was married with a young son. 2 of them were still suffering from the effects of captivity. Ted had a lifelong hatred of the Japanese and anything made in Japan. Like thousands of ex-servicemen, they all had stories to tell about their experiences. Most of their families never knew what they did till maybe 70 years after the war. How they chose to portray themselves to their families and the stories they told was based on their experiences. Some chose to change elements, merge facts with the truth. None of them made any great material contribution to the war, but all 3 of them suffered, some physically, emotionally, some with their dignity. How they chose to handle the stories about their war was how they dealt with their experiences. In the meantime, they decided to volunteer. They were veterans, and they sacrificed their futures for the benefit of those who were not able to fight.